Okay.
All right.
How do we adjust his?
You're sideways to me.
Yeah.
You're sideways to us.
Ah.
How do we change? We want to go there. Guys.
There we go.
They needed to know we're purposely turning it. Maddie's fiddling around with her camera again. All right, so with all that, I think it's interesting that you and I originally reached out to you about identity politics because I postulated that they fit into these 5 story patterns, and it was being utilized in a way, and that you said, well, all of them are being used, because I was kind of saying, well, I particularly have a problem with this one, and this one. They're like, well, they're all being used.
Right.
So I think it's interesting that an opening conversation, we're now at it a year and a half, 2 years later, and it still has some of these same themes are coming over. And that's the other thing I wanted to add it in terms of a film. When you get to the third act, 2 things. I know I said one thing. You definitely need to know who the enemy is so you can march your campaign. But the second thing is that the hero or heroes have to learn the theme stated.
Okay.
So that's like the wisdom that has to be implanted. It's the thing they kind of brush off in the first act. The elder or somebody usually tells the hero, and they usually brush it off. But it becomes the central question. Like, do you need this superpower, like in a Bruce Almighty movie? What if you were God for a day? Or what is that like? It kind of answers that question, and then typically at the end you realize, well, I don't need that superpower to be a good human and this type of thing.
Right.
So I wonder when you have quick, data downloads and you're grokking through something, you may be dancing around what is this theme that has been stated for humanity that is not being answered, and it's the one that keeps tripping us up. And so in the third act, got to know who the enemy is, and its enemy is just the system. To a degree, I think Kurt Doolittle points at it's lying in all forms. It isn't specifically the human behind that lie. It is that we tolerate deceits and all that.
Which is a strategy again.
Yeah, so we could have that it's the system is the enemy. We could say it is a class warfare if we wanted to personalize it more. There might be challenges on people being offended by that or nitpicking at it. Or I do think that in terms of moral code, it's relatively easy to say, hey, I'm against parasitism, or I'm against lying and deceit of all forms. I think we do find some success in that. But I'll hand it to you if you sense through this historical and even in biohistory, because if what we're going for at this end of this, at least our chapters of the movie, is that there's some resolution, there's a cathartic response, there's a reset of humanity's own nervous system. What is the theme? Like, what did we learn through all these convulsions and kind of troubled tales? What is it that the heroes, what do the good guys win, and why do the bad guys get the comeuppance kind of thing? It's all inside of this.
Because the one thing that keeps crossing my mind is that resolution might be the wrong goal. That if competing survival strategies is just how nature operates. So, for instance, with biohistory, one strategy starts to, high vigor as a strategy, starts to create high civilization. High civilization starts to erode vigor. So these are temperaments now. They're not even strategies. That maybe there's nothing we can do about that, and maybe there isn't anything we should do about that. Maybe the game is the way it's supposed to be. Maybe groups and identity are meant to compete against each other. And can that competition occur without it being a war of attrition, a race to the bottom, where all we're doing is committing property damages to each other? And when I think of that and say, okay, if we remove this idea that we have to destroy the enemy's property for us to even exist, it's a zero-sum thinking. If we're focusing on ourselves and the success of our own strategy, and they're doing the same thing, we've moved out of a context of war and battle and into one of competition and markets.
Right.
And if we can continue in that vein, maybe a lot of these things can be resolved. Okay, so this is how my mind works. So my mind goes to liberal theories on international politics, because that's what liberal theories on international politics were, that trade, economic war, negotiation, treaties were a replacement for war. NGOs and bringing in philanthropists and non-state actors was a way of expanding liberal theories on international politics against mad theories and against zero-sum or Marxist theories. And these are all the things that we now point at as corruption and deception, and as parasitism. Mm-hmm. So I think that maybe this notion that we can have competing groups and it not be about damages to each other ends up being idealistic and utopian. So the reason why is because as soon as we agree to that set of rules, it creates the incentive to break the rules. And it's on the presupposition that we can get other groups to compete against our rules. So now we're right back to where we were again, saying they play by their rules, we play by our rules. We have to make sure that our rules can be defended and succeed. And then we're back into conflict and war again. So anyways, I keep going in circles like this. I have been for about 2 weeks now. It goes around and around and around. And then what are the groups? So I would say that just in my experience, coming out of the 70s and 80s, growing up in that era where things like racism I could see a dramatic shift in prejudice against gays, against minority groups and so on, was a norm in the 70s. It was a norm when I was a young kid. And by the time I was in high school, it was gone. It was literally like, you just don't go there, and nobody had to deal with it anymore. Mm-hmm. And then why was it that worked? And it worked because the people involved, whether it be the minorities or gays or whatever, had a common ground on civic values, mm-hmm. social values that drew it together. Well, as soon as we do that, we've defined a new group, and essentially the civic values around diversity, multiculturalism, and inequity are now a separate group from our civic, and it starts all over again. So maybe we just have to accept that this is how humans progress.
I don't know, because it's convoluted, because there's other things at play too. Because I would agree, like, when I was growing up, I was born in the 80s. And so to think that, like, I grew up in an area where it was multicultural, like, it was diverse, and we loved it. Like, my mom always referred to my sister as being colorblind, that we didn't have any qualms about what people looked like or where they came from. They were just human. And so everything kind of settled down in that regard of whether you were, we also had gay family members, and they were accepted. Like, they were not ostracized or treated any differently. And so from my perspective, like, I felt like there was so much that got kind of settled. It was just, okay, now we're here and this is great and there's nothing to complain about. And then I started to notice there was something that happened when Obama became president. It was like all these other issues came to the table. There were already, from my perspective, but I'm also not inherently a minority. In Hawaii, I'm partially a minority, but I'm not even going to go there. And it seems as if now there's an upheaval of, like, all these other people who are claiming to be minorities are upset again. And the race card has come up, and now the whole gay marriage thing has happened, and so that's all good and done. But we're also not talking about the agenda at play and the eugenics and the vaccines and the foods and the things that kind of disrupt, what's that word when you're like gender dysphoria, like that's a whole other thing. And so these people, they're being manipulated and they don't even know it. And so now I'm looking like an asshole because I'm pointing the finger at the man, not the man, but the jerks at the top who are creating these things to create a bigger, you know, level of chaos and a bigger divide. And it creates, you know, other opportunities for the creeps to kind of infiltrate and to be like, but minorities, remember, you need to demand that you want this from these other people who aren't naturally going to give it to you. Because you know why? It's not natural what's happening. Is it doesn't resonate as true. It's deceitful and it's manipulative. We lost your video.
Oh.
And so it's upsetting because it's kind of like, now we're in a pickle. Who are we going to place blame on? Because to be able to trace who's really creating the harm and causing the problems between everybody, they don't exist. But that's what they would like to think, is that, you know, it's like the greatest trick the devil ever played is to convince everybody that he didn't exist. And so now it's us versus them versus like, but there's a fucking third party out here that nobody's talking about because they're invisible. It's not just the invisible hand of capitalism, but it's the invisible hand that's manipulating genetics and
monetary supply, money.
Everything is not what
media,
it seems.
Military.
In all of it. And so that again goes back to what I was saying about identifying it by strategy. That these are strategies that work in opposition to being fully informed, to reciprocity, and so on. And they've always been there. We've going right back to the days of Plato. We've had the use of food or education as a way of manipulating the masses. So this is something that keeps coming up. I don't buy that there's a continuous thread through history of a group that can exist and sustain itself that long. So this must be an emergent phenomenon that comes out, I think, at particular scales. When we get to a certain scale, that strategy comes up. And so then defining that enemy by its strategy, which is what? What is it? It's centralized power, it's deception, it's control of history, control of education, manipulation of temperament. And I think to a great extent, the only way that those strategies work is if they gain our buy-in. We have the middle, the masses have to participate in some degree, which is parasitism. Parasitism can only exist in a condition of trust. So it's a manipulation of consent. And I think that what allows that those conditions to come up for this emergent behavior to occur is on the lowest level of complexity, we would just say it's centralization. But I think what we're hitting again, just like when we got into biohistory, we're hitting on a point at which cooperation has diminishing returns. For us to cooperate, we centralize local costs. So local transaction costs. So for instance, I don't have to defend my stuff if we can have a centralized police force that I can call to defend it. I don't have to build bigger fences and alarm systems and so on. So we centralize local transaction costs so that more of our efforts can be focused on production. Okay. And then by doing so, we've outsourced whole areas of necessity, areas that are necessary for us to survive, off onto somebody else's hands. And by doing that, we create that nexus of control, which opens up the opportunity for parasitism. So I think what it is and I haven't put the argumentation together enough to say the middle is the volition of society. That the vast majority of people in our efforts is the engine that drives society, whether that's keeping the lights on or the roads clear or just treating each other well, is the volition behind society. And when we centralize these local costs, which then centralizes power, what we're doing is we're outsourcing things that we should keep within our control. So we should keep the definition of social norms within our control. We should keep the education and raising of our kids within our control. This way, there can be some centralization that allows us to get the benefits of cooperation at scale and have a bulwark against these diminishing returns. But is that possible? Is that a utopian ideal sort of mechanistic thinking again? Am I just buying into an argument around atomization to some degree?
I don't know. I think that if we look back in history, there's plenty of times where people would do apprenticeships and they would learn the skills, and then you would learn other skills from other people because other people weren't just experts, but they were well-rounded. And it kind of tosses out that term of, what is it, jack of all trades, master of none.
Yeah.
And because now we glorify the master or we glorify the specialist. And I think it's important for people to at least strive to be self-sufficient and to know how to do many different things really well.
Mm-hmm. So specialization is part of this then. The benefits of division of labor leading to specialization and leading to centralized control. Right. By specializing, we put blinders on to a broader context, which creates these diminishing returns or these impositions that we don't readily see. So that's an interesting point, which I think goes back again is who's raising our kids? Who's policing the social norms anymore? I've quoted this before. Wilfrid Laurier, and I think it was 1907. So there was trickle over from Manifest Destiny from the States up into Canada. So there was this notion of bringing in more people to establish the West. And Wilfrid Laurier had said, in spite of our values, obviously I'm paraphrasing, on freedom of religion and so on, we do expect people that come to Canada to become Canadian and to hold the values of Canada primary to anything else. Mm-hmm. That's a social norm. That's a social norm that he was speaking to. His ability to even say that, which he couldn't say today, is indication that there was a social norm in place that prevented a lot of the ramifications that we're seeing today as detrimental, which is the erosion of social norms and so on. And I think there's some gap somewhere between, I don't know, maybe the end of the First World War until the end of the Second World War, where we stopped doing that. We stopped policing socially. We stopped policing each other and standing up and saying, that's not cool. You can't do that. We don't behave.
But now we have a whole new level of that.
Yeah, that's true.
Backwards.
Yeah. Right. What is it sitting on? So we have social policing on the left, right? Rallying and shaming. So is it a matter of foundation?
Well, it's a matter of misinformation and people defending something that's not true, or their emotions have been manipulated. It's very ingenious of how it's all been played out, and it's we're fighting the beast.
Yeah. I
agree. So again, I keep bringing movie things in movies for an audience. You get those reveals, or you get the parts you're like, oh, why doesn't he just tell her the truth, and and part of the guise or the joke and whatever of a movie is how dishonest it is, or they have a reason why they can't say this, that, or the other thing, and then finally it leads up to that big spilling of the truth, and then there's a fall apart, and then you figure it out from there. that happens in our society too, that there's so much of this deception and dishonesty. So I know I keep bringing back to these types of themes so that we can look at it. So I think truth is a big thing. I think if we had more just truthfulness, I like where you go with competitiveness and understanding that this just might be the way nature works. It has competitions and survival strategies, and that if we can just be aware of, not to be the police force or whatever, but to say, oh, you're engaging in parasitism. Well, our community, society, whatever, this is how we defend on that. And then the other thing to chime in is I was definitely on the kill the enemy camp for a long time. And when you share the, hey, it's their strategy and their strategy has been winning. What about, it just shows where the weakness and the failure of our strategy is. What if we then take the time to defend our strategy? So in that third act, when you go, you build the plan, you rush the castle, the princess has been moved, there's this big, oh my God, so you have to like dig deep down, come up with a new plan, and then you go try to do the new plan, and then you get beat a second time, so you have to dig down really deep. And so the third time is where you really get it. And so maybe there is levels of attack, there's a level of a recovery version, and then this third one is like, well, I'm going to build a defense. And the defense is we're going to reestablish Western civilization that we like, operational language and epistemology and due diligence and warranty of speech. And we're establishing these as our commons and values to defend from. So what I'm doing is saying these could all be incorporated into this, I was saying like a resolve or a cathartic release, that we do have those stages, and you get the guys that want to swing the bats and go fight the fights, and they can do it. Like kind of when Kurt talked about, you have to have almost 3 operating governmental strategies. When you're in time of war, you're much more martial. When you are in times of peace and prosperity, then you are in kind of a capitalistic or cooperative dynamic. And then if you have an overabundance, then you look at some socialistic redistributive dynamics. Mm-hmm. So I kind of see where strategies also happen when and where they happen. Maddie got her camera to work, so we might be able to switch over to the laptop in a bit.
Okay. And I also think that those strategies, again, a million things come to mind. Remember the article you posted on tit for tat?
Yeah.
It sounds very much like that. Not just tit for tat in terms of exchange with another. It's adapting to the different situation. It's an adapting.
Right. It was a generous tit for tat is the winning strategy.
Right. That's what it was. And it seems to me that kin selection isn't so much about the kin as much as it is an adaptive strategy based on a criteria. And in kin group selection experiments, they're just arbitrarily use kin as the criteria. And maybe this is what we're missing. By universalizing our values, we've lost the criteria as to when we need to adapt our strategies. Mm-hmm. And by bringing back in an operational definition of what those values are, it gives us the limits to say, at this point we boycott, and at this point we kill.
Right.
Right. And then if that's the case, we don't have to worry about what other people's sense of fair play is. As long as we can preserve our right to boycott, which means being able to defend our territory, or retaliate in kind, without having to adopt their strategies, which is what tit for tat implies. That if they use dual ethics on us, we'll use dual ethics on them. And I don't think that's going to work with people raised with Western values or that come out of that pot, because I don't think we have the instincts for that.
Right.
It doesn't sit well with us. It doesn't sit well with us to the degree that we have always rejected group identity to some degree.
Right. But a defense too dual ethics, once identified, I think would be widely adopted.
Yeah, and I think that maybe our empiricism can reintroduce the criteria at which we adapt our strategies, and that right now we don't have a defensive strategy at all.
Right. Yeah, that's why we're kind of getting slaughtered out there.
Yeah, and I think that maybe some of that was a hubris out of the Enlightenment, which I think goes back to that class disdain, that our society was so robust, we could just open it up to anybody. That it's not vulnerable. It's the golden way, and liberty will free everybody. Not realizing that by doing that, it introduces all of these points of vulnerability, which we're seeing happen now.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it was the one that kind of reset my nervous system, because I was like, attack, kill, maim. And then I was like, wait, I could shift into self-defense. And then what does that look like? There's intellectual self-defense, there's building up the kin, there's developing community network of defense. There's the sheepdog, every man a judge, every man a sheriff. And then how does that get implemented? There's, I guess there's a part of me that hopes that if we could enlighten enough, then there'd be less bloodshed, because people would, to a degree, wake up like, yeah, that makes sense, and this other way doesn't make sense at all. Like, there's this coming to our senses, I think was one of the books. What about Kurt Doolittle's strategy? And then when I chimed in, he said the top 20% of the 20% are doing most of the damage, and then you have the top 20% of the 20% that are doing the most benefit. So I said, well, what if we could figure out who, what, where, all the grammar of either sides of those 4%, put our support to those that are doing the most benefit, and then attack, contain, self-defend from, whatever our tactics are. So we'd have to develop the strategy first, which we're kind of broad stroking, but then actual tactics, boots on the ground type stuff, to how do we knock out that 4% that is doing the most amount of damage. And then my encouragement was, and let's encourage the middle, because if the middle is the volitional force, and encourage the middle to do the same. So the middle then supports the 4% of benefit, and the middle starts to defend against and attack the 4% that are doing harm.
Yeah, and that's why when I came to a similar conclusion, that it's where the middle, it's what the middle tolerates and what the middle supports that manifests in the society. So you can have a leading edge thinker, and if the first rung is he has to get past the gatekeepers in the intellectual sphere, and then from there, if it gets adopted mainstream, that's when it distributes down.
Right.
And then vice versa, what we tolerate out of say crime or abuses of our system is what manifests. So it was that realization where I shifted out of politics and then started looking at social norms, that it's not really a political solution as much as it is awareness and definitions within the middle that could actually change this.
Well, but there could be a political solution. I think social norms and strategies is really important for moving the middle, but for the actual political support of the 4% benefiters that are, and for the 4% that are totally attacking, using, wasting our middle. So anyway, that's what I would sense. There's both.
Yeah, and I would agree, and I think that. So I think with how Kurt generally frames it, it's the 4% of the underclass that's detrimental, and the 4% of the upper class that's beneficial. And so this is why I go back to strategy again, because we have a 4% in the upper class that has been terribly detrimental, especially in the last years.
Right.
And social mobility seems to be a key to refreshing our commons and keeping things moving forward. and then the 4% of the underclass is always the 4% of the underclass. So I agree with that strategy, but
just to add on that, there's a 4% in the underclass, which is probably beneficial as well.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned social mobility, is that they need the pathway to be able to move up. If we have like a strict caste system, for instance, that 4% that can be terribly beneficial. If they don't have a path to move up in the social rankings, it never distributes. We don't get the benefit of it. So we need the social mobility. But I think that it's not so much the 4% of the top and bottom, and I liked how you framed it where it's benefit, detriment. We have to identify the 4% detriment across the entire social stratification, and vice versa. Support the 4% across the social stratification that's positive. Okay. And then, so I think from this to move from broad strokes to an actionable strategy is now a matter of definitions, of having clear definitions of what the values to support are and why, and then clear definitions on what undermines that. Okay. Which I think we've done some of that around some of the Enlightenment values, some of the argumentation around why equality works and when it doesn't, same as tolerance. But I think what we need is almost a bullet list of some of these values that we need to start building argumentation around so that we can build awareness and build understanding of it for the middle. That would be a good thing. I'm working on that. The other thing that I'm finding right now, because I've reached out locally to organizations around here, and I reached out to one man that's fairly well connected and is active on the bill, well, the memorandum, the M103 bill here in Canada, which was the anti-Islamic hate laws. And he responded, and then I realized I can't have a conversation with him because we don't share the same vocabulary. I'd be like typing stuff, he wouldn't have any idea what I'm talking about, or it'd be completely confusing. So I think that's the other thing, is that creating these definitions, I think, would help us communicate and actually abdicate beyond just our narrow circles that are quite on the fringe. We're about to run out of time again.
Okay.
You want to do one more?
Yeah, I do. Let's continue. We've got 10 minutes, and then we'll break and start up a third one.
Okay, and then take a 10-minute break between the second and third, so we can shuffle around a couple things here that we need to do.
Do we need
Sure.
to
I don't know.
We might need to go run an errand and take a 20-minute break. But...
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's no problem.
So bringing back in Myth Matrix and this distribution curve, remember we have the life sucks, my life sucks, I'm great, we're great, and life is great. Like that could be a distribution of how you talk to values, because trying to talk to somebody who is deeply alienated in a life sucks is different than not just vocabulary, but life perspective of somebody who's on the life's great, tip. And usually they say you can only kind of talk one, maybe two over, but usually it'd be like the my life sucks person can pull the life sucks guy over and up one.
Okay.
So when we talk about mobilization, I kind of see it in the narratives in the story and where they are in their life chapters and life circumstance of what might land. I also see it as, is somebody totally disengaged? Like, how do you communicate to somebody that just kind of is so deep in their own survival thing that they don't even have time for this conversation, even though this conversation could totally liberate or help them liberate or be a worthy cause or whatever. Mm-hmm. The second one would be, I'm engaged, but how do I even, be better at using my time, more effective arguments. Where would I refer somebody to so I don't have to repeat ad nauseum the stuff? I want to just kind of give somebody a data dump and a link and I'll follow up type thing. And then the third one is like the hardcore, I'll die for this. Like I'm totally on board. And so there might be kind of like in a Pareto principle, we want to focus on the 20% that are really, and we kind of have a bit for the wishy-washy of the 80%, and then maybe there's something out there. So this is kind of like, how does the strategy best apply, and how do the tactics roll out for those within that distribution?
Right. Okay. That's interesting. Because the last time we had talked about that, I was focusing on the 80% and then trying to find a language that would speak from the center out, which is trying to universalize the argument. But this is interesting. Focus on the tails. Drag one up and support the other. And then
the next one would support the next one.
Yeah. And
I
then
think
the middle
eventually you'll find the winning arguments for the middle, because those will be the ones that rise to the surface, and that actually will probably give you more of a temperature of what the middle is doing. By not providing specifically what we think it is, we could see what rises to the top.
Right, and then their language would evolve out of that.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because there was a comment earlier on the group, well, it was in a video, and talking about how I think there was mention of libertarians would, if they had actually read Marx, they would find a lot that they could relate to. Yeah, and I agree, because a lot of the sentiment behind it is a resentment for upper classes. Though anybody that's imposing your freedom or your liberty, right? So there's carryover between that ANACAP libertarian right and sort of our Antifa. They share the same narrative, which is, you know, my life sucks, and it's because of that guy over there, right? and so they're both focused in the same way. They're both responding to the same incentives, and they both are driven by the same emotional drives. So when I read that comment, I was like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with history or political concepts or anything else. It has everything to do with motivation. So it's interesting that if we identify the motivation, then we can speak from an operational definition of how these things are operating that speaks to that motivation. So that's good. And the outlines for like mini documentaries that I promised weeks ago, this informs that.
Yeah, I think those should still be put together. I want to pepper into this conversation again, because I know there was requests for it. We're at about less than a couple minutes. There is a huge opportunity with baby boomers that are probably looking to put their family fortune somewhere where they probably don't have a family anymore, or it's just one or two children, or whatever the dynamic is. Point being is that I told you before about the size of probate court. These are people that die that have no will, nothing written up, no way to handle it, and so it just goes to state-appointed attorneys to how to distribute their funds. Well, the state, we know inherently, is going to be supporting the state no matter what.
Yeah.
So if we could put ourselves, this group, into that fold and say, hey, this is what we're about. Where maybe it was difficult, or you picked up on it, was the permaculture connection, which is said, if you were given 30 acres out here in Hawaii, where would you start? Well, this permaculture guy that's been doing it somewhere in South America, or he said he would start on the decomposers, because it's the decomposers that create the dirt.
Right.
And so the reason I say let's put a focus to decomposers is that we have an opportunity with people dying to build this rich soil that we want, and to get out of systems that we want to get out of that are not working. If we have very clear principles that people are willing, quote, to die for, then you might say, hey, I haven't figured out what the hell to do with my estate. I support everything you're about. Here you go. Right. And then I like a decentralized model. So if somebody dies here in Hawaii and it's given to the Sheepdog or Proprietarian or whatever, then it's the local chapter takes care of that. Does that bring back fraternities and sororities on a level? Possibly. You know, there's more to this whole formula, but I like what we're working. I just wanted to add some salt and pepper about, hey, we have a funding mechanism, and I think we can make good use of it.
Okay, so let's take our 20-minute break because we're about to end. Sorry, our session's about to end. Let's take a 20-minute break.
Mm-hmm.
And then can you dive into the details of that? Because
probably
you've hit on the notion of fraternities and stuff, and this might start to inform organizational development as well, organizational structure. So, Ivar, are you going to come back in 20 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'm driving home. I was at the swimming pool.
So I'll do the same thing. I'll post the link. I have a suspicion the link is always the same, but I'll post the link again once I've started up the next session.
Yeah,
Sounds
okay.
good.
Fine.
Okay.
Sounds
Thanks,
good.
guys.
We'll message
Bye-bye.
you when you're back, so you don't have to hang solo. We'll just say, hey, we're back. Fired it up.
Sounds good.
All right.
Okay.
See ya.
Bye.
Aloha.
Bye.
Bye.